Do you even know where you are right now, Mr. Kessler? The lawyer's voice echoed through the courtroom, sharp and dripping with condescension. From the second-floor gallery, a few people exchanged glances, sensing the tension as it rippled through the air like static. Gerald Kessler sat still in the witness chair, his gnarled hands resting quietly in his lap. His posture was straight, impossibly straight for someone his age, but his pale blue eyes blinked slowly, betraying no rush to answer. I said. The lawyer leaned forward, voice rising. Do you know where you are? A low murmur rustled through the room. Judge Reynolds gave a slight but unmistakable frown from behind the bench, but he didn't intervene. Not yet. Gerald adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses. I heard you the first time, son. His voice was even, calm. It didn't rise, didn't stammer, just floated through the courtroom like it belonged there. The lawyer, Todd Mason, known around Charleston as both brilliant and brash, smirked and turned to the jury, as if Gerald's tone confirmed everything he'd planned. Ladies and gentlemen, Mason said, gesturing toward the old man, you're watching a man whose testimony cannot be trusted. He's confused. He contradicts himself. He takes too long to answer even the simplest questions. Objection, the defense attorney cut in. Withdrawn, Mason said quickly, refocusing. He turned back to Gerald, narrowing his eyes. You say you were at the gas station around 6:45 p.m. on June 18th, yet we have security footage of you getting back into your truck at 6:31. That's a 14-minute discrepancy. Can you explain that? A pause. Gerald inhaled slowly, his eyes drifting across the room, not evasive but deliberate, like someone measuring every detail. Then he looked at Mason. Not through him, at him. There was a woman crying in the parking lot, he said softly. She dropped her phone under her car. I helped her get it. The courtroom was still. And that took 14 minutes? Mason scoffed. Gerald blinked once. No, son. It took 30 seconds, but I stayed with her until she could breathe again. A quiet hush swept over the room. Even the judge tilted his head slightly. Mason faltered for just a second. Then, with renewed fire, you expect this court to believe that? That you were comforting some random woman instead of committing perjury to protect your friend? I don't expect you to believe anything, Gerald said, but I've got nothing to lie for. I've buried too many good men to waste my breath on lies. The silence was heavy now, not awkward, but reverent. And for the first time that morning, Todd Mason didn't have a retort. Outside, the South Carolina heat pressed against the courthouse walls like a living thing. Inside, however, the temperature had dropped, figuratively at least. Todd Mason sat at the plaintiff's table, fingers drumming against a manila folder. He wasn't used to being thrown off. Especially not by some slow-speaking, grandfatherly type. It had been his strategy. Corner the old man, get him flustered, discredit his testimony. But something about the way Gerald had held his gaze, unwavering, like a man who'd already stared down worse. Todd leaned toward his paralegal, whispering, pull his background. Military, maybe. That posture, the way he talks, it's not nothing. The paralegal nodded, already tapping at her laptop. On the other side, Gerald sat beside the defense attorney, a quiet presence. He hadn't said much after stepping down from the stand, but his presence lingered in the room like perfume after someone has left. Defense attorney Laura Tran reviewed her notes but couldn't help glancing sideways. You handled yourself well, Mr. Kessler. Gerald gave a small nod. I've been under pressure before. Todd Mason, meanwhile, was still fixated on the screen, his paralegal now angled toward him. At first, the basic information didn't rattle him. Name, Gerald Kessler. Age, 81, retired. Lives alone in a modest one-story home near Goose Creek. No priors, no drama. But then, his brow furrowed. Military service, United States Army. Rank Colonel, Special Forces, retired. Tours Vietnam, Operation Desert Storm. Decorations, Bronze Star, X2, Silver Star, Legion of Merit. Todd froze. He read it twice. The blood drained from his face. The gallery behind him blurred. For a brief second, all he could hear was the blood rushing in his ears. A colonel, Special Forces. That man had seen war. real war, and here Todd was trying to rattle him over timestamps and gas station receipts. He swallowed hard. "You okay?" his paralegal asked quietly. He didn't answer. His jaw clenched. Suddenly, his entire narrative was unraveling. He had painted Gerald as a confused old man. The jury now saw something else entirely. A decorated soldier. A man who had stared death in the eye and didn't blink. A man who helped a stranger cry in peace instead of walking away. Judge Reynolds looked down at the attorneys. "We'll resume with closing arguments after a short recess," he said, tapping his gavel. Todd barely heard him. He stood up, then sat back down, unsure what to do with the weight of what he now knew. Across the room, Gerald met his gaze. He didn't smirk, didn't gloat. He simply nodded once, respectful. Almost like he knew the war Todd was suddenly fighting wasn't in the courtroom anymore. The courthouse cafeteria was mostly empty, save for the vending machines humming in the corner and the dull clink of plastic forks against styrofoam trays. Todd Mason stood at the window, untouched coffee in his hand, staring down at the courthouse lawn. He barely noticed when Judge Reynolds stepped in. "Mind if I join you?" the judge asked. Todd turned, startled. "Of course not, Your Honor." Reynolds sat, removing his robe and folding it over the back of a chair. "You're rattled." Todd gave a hollow laugh. "Am I that obvious? You tried to break down a man who spent more time under enemy fire than you've spent practicing law." "I'd be rattled too." Todd finally sat across from him. "I didn't know about his service, his record." The judge nodded slowly. "Most people don't. Gerald doesn't talk about it, doesn't lead with it. That's the difference." Todd leaned back, rubbing his forehead. "I thought I had this case nailed, but that man, he's not just believable, he's undeniable." Reynolds looked at him with a kind of tired wisdom. "People like Gerald carry things that never show up in court files, things heavier than medals." Meanwhile, in the quiet of a small Charleston house, Gerald stepped out onto his back porch, a glass of iced tea in one hand, a weathered photo in the other. In the picture, a younger man in uniform standing beside two fellow soldiers, all dust-covered and sunburnt. He squinted at it, as if the years might peel back. His phone rang inside. He let it ring once, twice, before stepping back in. "Hello?" "Mr. Kessler," came Laura Tran's voice. "Sorry to bother you. I just wanted to check in before closing arguments tomorrow." "See how you're feeling?" Gerald smiled faintly. "You don't need to worry about me, Ms. Tran. Worry about your opponent. He'll be up all night wondering if I've got more to say." She laughed. "That's exactly what I was hoping." He paused, then said, "You know, I don't mind if the court knows who I am. I just don't think a uniform makes a man honest." That comes from somewhere else. There was a silence, soft but thoughtful, before she said, "I think they already know, Gerald, without the uniform." After hanging up, he walked down the narrow hallway to his study. On the wall hung a single shadow box. Inside, a set of dog tags, a worn army patch, and a bronze star. He'd never displayed it before last year. His daughter had insisted. Said people should know. But Gerald knew the truth. The real battles weren't in jungles or deserts. They were in quiet courtrooms and gas station parking lots, in choices that didn't earn applause, just peace. He stood there for a long time, staring at the medals he never wanted but couldn't forget. The courtroom buzzed low with conversation as people shuffled back to their seats. The afternoon sun angled through the high windows, casting long shadows across the oak floors. The energy was different now, quieter, heavier, as if everyone sensed the ground had shifted beneath them. Todd Mason sat alone at his table, the manila folder closed in front of him. He hadn't opened it since recess. Across the aisle, Laura Tran leaned toward Gerald. "You don't have to speak again. We're within our rights to rest our case and go to closing." Gerald shook his head slowly. "Let him ask what he needs." She hesitated. "You sure? I've been cross-examined by worse." Todd stood up. "Your Honor, with the court's permission, I'd like to recall Mr. Kessler for one final question." Judge Reynolds gave a measured nod. "Proceed." Gerald rose, walking steadily back to the witness stand. Every eye followed him. Todd didn't approach this time. He stayed behind his table. No tricks this time, he said. Just one question. Gerald waited. Why did you agree to testify for Mr. Halloran? The courtroom held its breath. That was the question they'd all been circling around. Gerald glanced toward the defendant, a middle-aged man with tired eyes and a thin frame, accused of assaulting a man in a gas station altercation, a fight no one had video of, just conflicting accounts. He's my neighbor, Gerald began. We don't talk much. He keeps to himself, but that night I saw the whole thing from across the parking lot. He paused, then looked directly at Todd. I saw a man try to shove his way past Halloran's truck with a cart full of beer. The guy was already yelling before he got close. Drunk, aggressive. Halloran told him to back off. The other guy threw the first punch. Todd's voice was quiet now. You're saying your only reason is the truth? No, Gerald said. It's more than that. He leaned forward slightly. I've seen men get labeled monsters because someone louder had the floor first. I've seen good men ruined because no one stood up for what actually happened. I couldn't let that happen again, not on my watch. For a moment, even Todd forgot his role in the proceedings. There was no more hostility, just something quiet and painful and human between them. Thank you, Todd said, and it was sincere. Gerald nodded once. You're welcome. Judge Reynolds cleared his throat softly. Unless either party has anything further, we'll proceed to closing arguments. Todd looked down at his notes and then slowly closed them. No further questions, Your Honor. Laura Tran smiled faintly. We rest our case. The judge looked at both sides. Very well. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, we will now hear closing statements. But the real statement had already been made, and everyone in the room knew it. The courtroom lights flickered slightly as the clock on the back wall ticked toward late afternoon. The jury sat in solemn silence, 12 faces lined with thought, each of them now carrying a burden they hadn't asked for. Todd Mason stood, straightening his jacket. He moved with less swagger than he had that morning. No more theatrics, no more raised voice, just clarity. In the beginning, he said, this case looked simple. A man hits another man. One ends up in the hospital, the other ends up in court, but nothing's ever that simple, is it? He let that settle. We assume we know people based on how they look, how they speak, how old they are. I did it myself. I looked at Mr. Kessler and assumed I could shake his story. What I learned today is that you don't always see the truth right away. Sometimes it's beneath the surface, behind a calm voice or a steady gaze. He turned to Gerald briefly. Mr. Kessler didn't come here to impress you. He came here because something inside him couldn't stay silent. Todd's eyes swept the jury. You have to decide what happened that night, but more importantly, you have to decide who you believe. And I believe the truth walked in here wearing an old jacket, carrying more history than any of us could measure. He sat down quietly. Laura Tran rose next. Calm, collected, but undeniably firm. You've seen the footage, you've heard the testimony, and you've felt the weight of Mr. Kessler's words. He didn't just recount events, he took you there, into that moment, into that parking lot, into the kind of decision we all pray we never have to make. She moved closer to the jury box. Halloran didn't strike out first, he defended himself. And the only reason you know that is because someone had the courage to tell the truth when it mattered most. A man who's carried responsibility heavier than most of us could understand. She placed her hands gently on the edge of the podium. This case is not just about justice for Mr. Halloran. It's about whether truth, even when spoken softly, is still louder than assumption. She walked back to her seat. The courtroom stilled. The judge gave his final instructions. Then the jury was dismissed to deliberate. Gerald rose and stepped out into the hallway, finding a bench beneath a faded portrait of Abraham Lincoln. His hands were steady, his breath even. Moments later, Todd Mason emerged and approached him. He didn't speak right away. Then finally, I was wrong about you. Gerald gave a quiet smile. You weren't the first. You won't be the last. Todd nodded slowly. You changed how I see things. That, Gerald said, is why I came. They sat in silence after that, not as lawyer and witness, but as two men who finally saw each other. The jury returned faster than anyone expected. 29 minutes. The gallery was already full again. Word had spread during recess, and people who had nothing to do with the case now leaned forward in their seats, drawn in not by spectacle, but by something rarer: sincerity. Judge Reynolds took his seat. Has the jury reached a verdict? The foreman, a middle-aged woman in a grey blouse, stood with the slip of paper in her hands. Her voice didn't tremble. "We have, Your Honor." She handed the verdict to the bailiff, who passed it to the judge. Reynolds scanned the paper and gave a small, nearly imperceptible nod. "In the matter of the state of South Carolina versus Daniel Halloran on the charge of felony assault," he said, "we find the defendant," he looked up, "not guilty." A collective exhale swept through the courtroom. Halloran's shoulders dropped. His wife clutched his arm, silent tears on her cheeks. Even the defendant himself seemed stunned, like he hadn't dared to hope this moment might actually come. Gerald, seated quietly near the aisle, simply nodded to himself as if checking off something long overdue. Todd Mason remained seated. No outburst, no disappointment, only reflection. Judge Reynolds continued, dismissing the jury and formally ending the trial, but the room had already moved on. People stood, shook hands, whispered thanks. Outside the courtroom doors, the warm late-day sun poured over the steps like gold. Gerald descended slowly, step by step, pausing only when Todd appeared beside him. "You didn't have to stay," Gerald said. Todd shrugged. "Didn't feel right leaving." There was a pause. "Do you ever think about it?" Todd asked. "What you went through in the service?" Gerald looked out across the courthouse lawn, where a few birds pecked near the trimmed hedges. "Every day," he said simply. "But not always the bad parts. I remember the men, the moments of clarity. Times when you're scared out of your mind but still do the right thing." Todd looked down at his shoes. "That's rare." "It shouldn't be," Gerald replied. "Truth isn't always loud. Sometimes it's just steady, like a compass." Halloran and his wife stepped out next. When he spotted Gerald, he crossed the space quickly, stopping just short of him. "I don't know what to say," Halloran murmured, his voice choked. "You saved my life." "No," Gerald said. "You just needed someone to see it." They shook hands, firm, quiet, honest. Then Gerald turned to go. Todd called after him, "Hey, Colonel." Gerald paused and looked back. Todd smiled faintly. "Thank you for your service." Not just in uniform, Gerald gave a small nod, tipping his head the slightest bit. "You're welcome, son." As he walked away, cane tapping gently against the stone steps, a breeze stirred through the trees. It smelled of summer and dust and memory, and something else too. Closure. 2 weeks had passed. The courthouse was quiet again, its halls echoing only the shuffle of papers and the occasional cough from a clerk. But in a quiet office on the 3rd floor, Todd Mason sat behind his desk, staring at a letter that had arrived that morning. No return address, just his name, typed. He opened it slowly. The paper inside was thick, the kind you don't find in stores anymore. The handwriting was elegant, deliberate, every letter shaped with care. "Mr. Mason, I've never been one for speeches, and I certainly didn't expect to write you a letter, but I thought maybe you'd want to know why that trial mattered more than just a verdict. Back in '72, I watched a fellow soldier get court-martialed for something he didn't do. He was quiet, poor, and brown. No one believed him. I did, but I kept my mouth shut because I was afraid of what it would cost me. He died 2 months later overseas. I never got to tell him I was sorry. That mistake followed me for 50 years. You can bury a truth, son, but it doesn't stay buried. Not really." So when I saw what happened in that gas station, when I saw Halloran getting blamed for something I knew he didn't start, I remembered that silence, and I chose to speak instead. You tried to tear my story down, and I don't hold that against you. You were doing your job, but you also listened when it mattered. That's more than most. I've seen battlefields. I've seen lies dressed up as truth. But in that courtroom you changed, and that to me is victory. Keep going, you're closer than you think. Gerald Kessler. Todd read the letter twice, then a third time. When he finished, he set it down carefully, as though it might vanish if handled too roughly. Outside his window, students crossed the campus lawn across the street, laughing, chasing deadlines, chasing futures. He wondered how many of them would ever face something as real as Gerald had, or how many would ever realize when a moment like that arrived. He stood, walked to the shelf behind his desk, and removed a dusty frame that held his law school diploma. In its place, he slid the letter. No fanfare, no signature, just words that mattered. Across town, Gerald sat on his porch sipping tea as the sun dipped low behind the oaks. A soft breeze stirred the flag in his front yard. He didn't need to see the verdict again. He didn't need thanks. The silence inside him, the one that had lived there since '72, had finally quieted. Some truths once spoken don't echo. They settle, and they stay.